The pharmacist said, "Your wife's been picking up prenatal vitamins, but you had a vasectomy." The pharmacist pulled me aside and whispered this while I was picking up my blood pressure medication. I laughed awkwardly. "There must be a mistake. We can't have children. Sir, she's been getting them monthly for 6 months. Always pays cash. Always comes alone. I'd had a vasectomy 8 years ago after our second child died during birth. Lisa had nearly died too, and we decided together. No more pregnancies. The risk was too high. She'd been there for my procedure, held my hand through recovery. Driving home, my mind raced. Lisa had been glowing lately, happier. She'd quit wine completely, started yoga, been eating incredibly healthy. I'd thought it was her new wellness kick after turning 40. When I got home, I searched everything while Lisa was at her book club, found the vitamins hidden behind paint cans in the garage. The prescription label was partially scratched off, but I could make out a date, 6 months ago, just like the pharmacist said. That night, I watched Lisa carefully. She definitely looked different. Fuller face, glowing skin. She kept touching her stomach unconsciously. How had I missed this? "Honey," I said at dinner, "maybe we should try for another baby." She dropped her water glass. It shattered on the floor. "What? You had a vasectomy?" "We decided. Vasectomies can be reversed." "No," she said firmly. "We made that choice for good reasons." But her hand went to her stomach protectively as she said it. I called my urologist the next morning, confirming my vasectomy was still effective. 0 sperm count at your last check. Shooting blanks, as they say. Why do you ask? That evening, I installed a tracker on Lisa's car. The next day, when she said she was going to yoga, the tracker showed her at an OB/GYN office across town. Not her regular doctor. She was there for 2 hours. When she came home, she was crying. Happy tears, she claimed, about a work promotion. But I saw the ultrasound photo peeking out of her purse. I said nothing. 3 days later, she went to book club again. The tracker led me to an apartment complex downtown. I watched her enter Unit 338 with a casserole dish. Through the window, I saw her hand it to a man I didn't recognize. He hugged her, his hand lingering on her stomach. I was about to storm in when another woman appeared. Pregnant. Then another. And another. 5 pregnant women, all at different stages, all treating Lisa like their best friend. The man was serving them dinner like some bizarre polygamous family. I took photos and went home shaking. The next morning, after Lisa left for work, I searched deeper. Found a hidden folder on her laptop, password protected. It took me hours to crack it. Inside were contracts, legal documents, all signed by Lisa. She wasn't pregnant, she was managing pregnant women. The documents were surrogacy agreements, but not normal ones. These women were all carrying babies with the same father, the man from the apartment. But the genetic material documentation made me vomit. The eggs weren't from the surrogates. They were from one source, purchased from a fertility clinic. The seller was listed as L. Mitchell, Lisa Mitchell, my wife. She'd been selling her eggs and managing surrogate pregnancies for wealthy couples. The prenatal vitamins were to improve her egg quality for harvesting. Each successful pregnancy earned her $50,000. She'd already delivered 12 babies. I confronted her that night, throwing the contracts on the table. "It's not what you think," she said calmly. "You're selling our potential children." "No," she said. "I'm selling your actual children." "That's impossible. I had a vasectomy." She smiled coldly. "You had a vasectomy, but not the one you think." She pulled out medical records, my real vasectomy documents from 8 years ago. But they weren't for a vasectomy. They were for a surgical sperm extraction and cryogenic preservation. "The doctor is my cousin," she explained. "You thought you were getting sterilized. Instead, we extracted and froze enough sperm for hundreds of pregnancies. You signed consent forms thinking they were standard surgical papers." "That's illegal. That's assault." "Actually, check page 12 of what you signed. You gave me full reproductive rights to any stored genetic material in case of your death or incapacitation." "But I'm neither." She pulled out another document. "According to this psychiatric evaluation from 3 years ago, you've been declared mentally incompetent. Remember when you had that reaction to medication and blacked out for a week? You were actually in a psychiatric hold. I had you declared unfit. My world spun. Our daughter, at book club." "There is no book club. I've been visiting your children. You have 18 of them now, all being raised by wealthy families who think they got anonymous donor sperm. But they all have your eyes, your smile." I reached for my phone to call the police, but Lisa was faster. "I wouldn't. Check your browser history. Check your sent emails." I looked. Hundreds of emails I didn't send, soliciting illegal services. Browser history full of illegal content, all time-stamped during my blackout 3 years ago. You call the police, you go to prison. she said simply. Or you can keep taking your blood pressure medication and enjoy the comfortable life my business provides. That's when I realized my medication wasn't for blood pressure. The side effects I'd been having, memory gaps, confusion, docility, weren't side effects at all. How long? I asked. Since the beginning. Since our real son died. I blamed you for wanting another baby. So I decided to give you dozens. Just not how you expected. But the worst part was what she said next. Your parents know. They're customers. Your mother is raising your son. She paid premium for a grandchild that was actually blood-related. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at Lisa as she calmly explained that my mother was raising my biological son. The medication fog in my brain made it hard to process, but the horror cut through clearly enough. My mother had paid $50,000 for a grandchild that was actually blood-related, and she'd been raising him for 3 years without me knowing. Lisa watched me carefully, probably looking for signs I might do something stupid like call the police or run. I forced my face to stay blank, nodding slowly like I was still too drugged to really understand. Inside, my mind was racing, but I knew I had to pretend compliance while I figured out what to do next. Lisa smiled and touched my hand, telling me everything would be fine as long as I kept taking my medication and didn't make trouble. I nodded again, playing the part of the compliant husband she'd created through years of drugging. She kissed my forehead and went upstairs to bed, leaving me sitting there with the contract still spread across the table. That night, I lay awake while Lisa slept peacefully beside me, and I started planning how to secretly reduce my medication dosage. Her breathing was deep and steady, completely relaxed, while I stared at the ceiling counting all the ways she'd violated me. Around 3 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and went to the bathroom where she kept my pill organizer. I took out tomorrow's evening pill and broke it in half over the sink, flushing one piece down the toilet. Then I put the remaining half back in the organizer. I'd been taking these pills for 3 years, trusting they were for blood pressure. The mental clarity that started returning over the next few days was both terrifying and empowering. Small things came back first, like remembering what I'd eaten for breakfast without having to check the trash. Then bigger things, like realizing I could follow conversations better, and my thoughts didn't feel like they were moving through mud. By day 4, I understood just how much Lisa had been controlling my mind. I began palming half my evening pill each night and hiding the pieces in a small tear in the seam of the mattress on my side of the bed. Lisa never noticed because she was too busy with her business meetings and surrogate management. With clearer thinking, I started reviewing the evidence Lisa showed me more critically and noticed inconsistencies in the timestamps of the planted browser history. I waited until Lisa left for yoga one morning, then opened my laptop and checked the dates carefully. The illegal emails she claimed I sent were all timestamped during a weekend when I'd been at a work conference in Denver. I had plane tickets, hotel receipts, and photos with colleagues that proved I was nowhere near my computer. The browser history, full of illegal content, showed activity on dates when I'd been at my mother's house for Thanksgiving dinner. The dates overlapped with times I had solid alibis for being elsewhere. I began documenting these discrepancies in a hidden note on my phone, creating a password-protected file that looked like a grocery list, but actually contained all the proof that Lisa had fabricated the evidence. Each inconsistency I found made me angrier, but also more hopeful. If I could prove the planted evidence was fake, maybe I could go to the police after all. Lisa announced she had a business trip to meet with potential clients and would be gone for 3 days. She told me this over dinner, watching my face carefully as she explained she'd be traveling to meet wealthy couples interested in her services. I maintained my usual docile demeanor while internally recognizing this was my opportunity to investigate more thoroughly. I nodded slowly and asked simple questions about when she'd be back, acting like I could barely follow the conversation. She seemed satisfied with my confusion, reminding me twice to take my medication while she was gone. I acted slightly more confused than usual to sell the idea that the medication was working, forgetting where I'd put my keys and asking her the same question twice. She left the next morning looking pleased that I was still under control, kissing me goodbye and reminding me again about my pills. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I stopped pretending. The morning after Lisa left, I drove to a store 3 towns over and bought a burner phone with cash. I'd found the name of a private investigator online during one of my clear-headed moments, someone who specialized in fraud cases. Back in my car, I dialed the number with shaking hands. A man answered on the second ring, his voice professional but warm. I explained my situation carefully, watching for signs he thought I was delusional, but he just listened quietly and asked specific questions about the medical fraud and planted evidence. He told me his name was Rajesh Dominguez and that he'd handled cases involving medical coercion before. He listened without judgment and agreed to meet at a coffee shop across town in 2 hours. I spent those 2 hours driving around aimlessly, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure I wasn't being followed, before finally parking at the coffee shop. Rajesh was already there, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a serious expression. We sat in a back corner booth where no one could overhear. Rajesh reviewed the contracts and medical documents I'd secretly photographed over the past week, zooming in on details and taking notes. His face grew darker as he read through the fake vasectomy paperwork and the psychiatric evaluation documents. He confirmed that what Lisa did constituted multiple crimes, including medical fraud and reproductive coercion. The sperm extraction without real consent was assault. The drugging was poisoning. The fake psychiatric hold was kidnapping. He explained that the planted evidence complicated things, but wasn't insurmountable if we built a strong countercase. We needed to prove the timestamps were false, and that I had alibis for when the illegal activity supposedly occurred. His validation that I wasn't crazy gave me the first real hope I'd felt in years. Someone believed me. Someone with professional experience saw exactly what Lisa had done and confirmed it was criminal. We talked for 3 hours, planning how to gather more evidence without alerting Lisa. Rajesh told me to document everything, photograph every paper I could find, and keep reducing my medication so my mind would stay clear. I decided to visit my mother unannounced, needing to see if Lisa's claim about her raising my biological son was true. The drive to my mother's house took 40 minutes and I rehearsed what I'd say the entire way. When I knocked on her door, she looked surprised but happy to see me. Then I heard a child's voice from inside, asking who was at the door. My mother's face went pale as a 3-year-old boy came running to see who'd arrived. I found her at home with this little boy who had my exact eye color and facial structure. He had the same cowlick on the left side of his head that I'd always hated about my own hair. The same slightly crooked front tooth. The same way of tilting his head when he was curious. The shock of seeing my own features reflected in this child I never knew existed nearly broke my composure. He stared up at me with interest, asking my mother who I was. She told him I was an old friend and sent him to play in the other room. Her hands were shaking. My mother realized I know the truth and broke down crying right there in her entryway. She sank onto the stairs and covered her face, sobbing about how sorry she was. Between gasps, she explained that Lisa had approached her 3 years ago with an opportunity. Lisa told her I had donated sperm before our marriage, back in college when I needed money. She said I'd always felt guilty about those donations and worried about unknown children out there. Lisa claimed she could arrange for my mother to adopt one of those children, giving her a grandchild who was actually blood-related. She paid $50,000 and signed confidentiality agreements, promising never to tell me because Lisa said I'd be upset about the adoption. My mother had believed every word because it came from Lisa, her trusted daughter-in-law who she'd known for 12 years. I saw she was another victim of Lisa's manipulation, though her complicity still stung deeply. She'd been raising my son for 3 years, watching him grow, and never once questioned whether I deserved to know. Part of me wanted to scream at her for being so gullible, but looking at her broken expression, I knew Lisa had played her perfectly. Back home, I carefully searched for where Lisa might keep original documents related to the psychiatric hold and incompetency declaration. I started in her home office, going through every file in her desk, but found nothing. Then I checked our bedroom, looking in boxes at the top of the closet. Still nothing. Finally, I went to the garage and started searching behind old storage boxes and paint supplies. I found a locked file box in the back corner, hidden behind 3 gallons of paint we'd bought years ago for a project we never finished. The box was small but heavy, made of metal with a combination lock. I photographed the lock from multiple angles and sent the images to Rajesh using my burner phone. He texted back within minutes saying he could get it open without leaving evidence of tampering. We arranged for him to come over the next morning while Lisa was still away. Rajesh arrived at 9 the next morning with a small toolkit and got to work on the lock immediately. It took him 20 minutes of careful manipulation before the lock clicked open. Inside were files that made my stomach turn. The psychiatric evaluation that declared me incompetent was conducted by someone named Dr. Joyce Vance, and Rajesh recognized the name immediately from a fraud case he'd worked 2 years ago. She was another of Lisa's associates, someone who'd conduct fake evaluations for money. There were also medical records from the hospital stay during my supposed medication reaction, showing they'd admitted me for acute psychosis and confusion. But attached to those records was a toxicology report that Lisa had somehow kept from being filed officially. The report showed high levels of a drug called scopolamine in my system, a substance that causes confusion, memory loss, and suggestibility. The medication reaction that hospitalized me was actually a drug Lisa slipped into my food. Everything was orchestrated to create the legal framework for her control. Rajesh photographed every single page while I stood there shaking with rage. He told me this evidence was exactly what we needed to prove Lisa had systematically destroyed my autonomy and built a cage around me using fake medical documents and strategic drugging. We had her now. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of every page, my hands shaking so bad I had to steady them against the box. Each document felt heavier than the last as I realized what I was looking at. The earliest paper was dated 9 years ago, before our son died, before Lisa even got pregnant. She'd been planning this from the start, setting up shell companies and meeting with lawyers about reproductive rights while I thought we were building a family. The medical consent form she'd forged with Aaron's help went back to our first year of marriage. I wasn't just discovering a crime, I was uncovering a decade-long scheme where I'd been the target all along. My throat tightened as I photographed a document showing Lisa had researched my family's genetic history, cataloging health conditions and physical traits like I was livestock. She'd evaluated my worth as breeding stock before we even said our wedding vows. Rajesh watched me work, occasionally pointing out details I'd missed. He showed me how to adjust the lighting on my phone to capture the text more clearly, how to organize the photos by date and category. When we finished, he pulled out his laptop and walked me through setting up encrypted cloud storage that Lisa couldn't access, even if she found my passwords. He created 3 separate backup systems, spreading the evidence across different platforms so nothing could be erased completely. Then he taught me how to communicate without leaving traces, showing me apps that deleted messages automatically, and how to use public Wi-Fi networks so my location couldn't be tracked. I felt like I was learning to be a spy in my own life, building secret channels right under Lisa's nose. Rajesh explained counter-surveillance basics, how to check if my car had tracking devices, how to spot if someone was following me. The skills felt paranoid and necessary at the same time. Lisa came home 3 days later looking relaxed and happy. I met her at the door with a hug, playing my usual role of the confused, medicated husband who barely remembered what day it was. She asked if I'd taken my pills on schedule, and I nodded slowly, blinking like the medication made me tired. Inside, I was cataloging everything she did with new awareness. The way she checked the pill organizer to count how many I'd supposedly taken, how she steered conversation away from her trip when I asked basic questions about where she'd been. The casual touches that seemed affectionate, but were actually checking my alertness level, gauging how drugged I was. She mentioned making dinner and I offered to help, then fumbled with the cutting board in a way that made her smile. She thought I was deteriorating, getting worse, more dependent. I let her believe it while my mind stayed sharp and calculating behind the foggy performance. That week I started going to therapy sessions with Freya more often, scheduling appointments twice weekly instead of monthly. I told her I was having more memory problems lately, forgetting conversations and losing track of time. She looked concerned and asked detailed questions about my medication, when I took it, how it made me feel. I described the confusion and gaps carefully, giving her just enough to raise alarm without making it obvious I was building a case. Freya suggested getting my prescription reviewed by another doctor, someone who could do a full medication assessment. She said memory issues this severe weren't normal for standard blood pressure medication. I agreed slowly, like I was having trouble following her logic. She made notes in her file and told me she wanted to order some tests. I could tell she suspected something wasn't right but was being careful, proceeding professionally instead of jumping to conclusions. 2 weeks later, Lisa announced another book club meeting. I nodded absently while she got ready, then tracked her car on my phone as she drove across town. The tracker led to the same apartment complex where I'd seen the pregnant women before. I parked down the street and watched through binoculars Rajesh had given me. This time, I paid attention to body language, not just counting heads. A woman I recognized from the photos in Lisa's files arrived looking upset, her hands clenched tight around her purse. She was about 6 months pregnant based on how she carried herself, her movements careful and strained. When she reached the apartment door, she hesitated for a long moment before knocking, like she didn't want to go inside. Lisa answered, and the woman's shoulders slumped in defeat. Through the window, I could see Lisa touching her arm, talking in that soothing way she used when manipulating people. The pregnant woman nodded but didn't look convinced. I waited in my car until the meeting ended 2 hours later. The pregnant woman came out alone, walking slowly to a beat-up sedan parked near mine. I got out and approached carefully, keeping my distance so I wouldn't scare her. I introduced myself as someone who had concerns about the surrogacy program, keeping my voice low and calm. She froze when she saw me, her eyes going wide with panic. For a second, I thought she'd run or scream. Then her face crumpled and she started crying right there in the parking lot. She told me her name was Haley and that she was trapped in a contract she didn't understand when she signed it. She'd thought it was normal surrogacy, helping a couple have a baby while earning money for college. But the contract had clauses about genetic ownership and non-disclosure agreements that scared her. She'd tried to back out 2 months ago, and Lisa had threatened her with lawsuits that would destroy her financially. Haley wiped her eyes and asked who I was, why I cared about Lisa's program. I told her I was the genetic father of the baby she was carrying, that Lisa was my wife and that I hadn't consented to any of this. Her mouth fell open and she grabbed the car door for support. She asked if I was serious, if I really didn't know about the pregnancies. I showed her my medical records on my phone, the fake vasectomy papers, some of the evidence I'd gathered. She read through it with shaking hands, her breathing getting faster. Then she looked up at me and said she'd help me if I helped her. She was terrified about what would happen after the baby was born, whether Lisa would take the child and disappear. I promised I'd do everything I could to protect her and document what Lisa was really doing. We exchanged numbers using the secure app Rajesh had set up for me. Haley agreed to meet me at the public library the following week, with her contract copy and any other papers she had. The library meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Lisa thought I was at a doctor's appointment. Haley showed up looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. We found a quiet corner in the reference section, where nobody would overhear us. She pulled out a folder thick with papers and pushed it across the table. The contract was worse than I'd imagined, full of legal language about genetic material ownership and mandatory non-disclosure periods that lasted 20 years. But as Haley explained the terms, something else became clear. She told me there weren't 18 pregnancies like Lisa had claimed to me. There were actually 23 women carrying babies with my genetic material. 5 more were in early stages, being kept separate from the main group that met at the apartment. Lisa had lied about the scale of her operation, probably to keep me from realizing just how big the business had become. Haley spread out more papers showing text messages from Lisa. I read through them carefully, my anger building with each one. The messages showed Lisa threatening legal action if Haley didn't comply with medical appointments. There were texts about diet restrictions and activity limits that went way beyond normal surrogacy care. Lisa had sent one message saying Haley could lose everything she owned if she violated the non-disclosure agreement. Another text threatened to report Haley to immigration authorities even though Haley was a citizen. The coercion was obvious and documented, proof that Lisa wasn't just running a surrogacy business, but actively victimizing vulnerable women. I photographed every message and every page of the contract. This wasn't just about me anymore or my violated reproductive rights. Lisa had hurt multiple people, trapped them in situations they couldn't escape, used their desperation against them. I needed help securing my devices and detecting whatever monitoring software Lisa had installed. I reached out to Carlos, a friend from high school who worked in IT security. I hadn't talked to him in years, but I remembered he was smart with computers and trustworthy. I texted him using my secure phone, suggesting we catch up over coffee. We met at a chain restaurant near his office where the Wi-Fi was public and unsecured. I kept the conversation casual at first, asking about his job and his family. Then I mentioned having some concerns about my laptop security, wondering if he knew ways to check for monitoring software. Carlos looked at me carefully, his expression shifting from friendly to professional. He asked a few pointed questions about what kind of monitoring I suspected. I gave him enough hints without saying too much. He nodded slowly and offered to do a security check on my laptop, said he could come by my house when my wife was out. I felt relief wash through me as I accepted his offer, knowing I was building a team of people who could help me take Lisa down. Carlos arrived 2 days later while Lisa was at work, carrying a sleek laptop bag and a small toolkit. He set up at the kitchen table and plugged in a portable hard drive before asking me to bring him all my devices. I handed over my laptop, my phone, and the tablet I barely used anymore. He worked silently for nearly an hour, running diagnostic programs that filled the screen with scrolling code I couldn't understand. Finally, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. I asked what he found, and he turned the laptop screen toward me, pointing at a list of running processes. Every keystroke I'd typed for the last 3 years was logged and sent to an external server. Every website I visited, every file I opened, every password I entered. The spyware was professional grade, the kind used by corporations to monitor employees or private investigators to track targets. He showed me the GPS tracking that pinged my location every 5 minutes, creating a detailed map of everywhere I'd been. The camera and microphone could be activated remotely without any indicator light. Lisa had been watching and listening to everything, probably for years. Carlos asked if I wanted him to remove it, and I almost said yes before stopping myself. If Lisa noticed the spyware was gone, she'd know I was onto her surveillance. Instead, I asked if he could create a hidden partition, something that looked normal on the surface but let me work privately. He nodded and said he'd done similar setups for people in bad situations before, clients escaping abusive relationships or whistleblowers gathering evidence. He spent another 2 hours building what he called a virtual machine, a completely separate operating system hidden inside my regular one. To access it, I needed to hold down 3 specific keys during startup. The partition was encrypted and isolated from the main system. Anything I did there wouldn't show up in the spyware logs. He installed secure browsers, encrypted email clients, and file storage that couldn't be traced. When he finished, he showed me how to switch between the regular system and the secure one seamlessly. The regular partition would keep running its normal programs, so Lisa's monitoring wouldn't detect any change in my computer usage patterns. He even set up fake activity generators that would occasionally click links and type random searches to maintain the illusion I was still using the device normally. I felt like a prisoner who'd just been handed a key to his cell. Carlos packed up his equipment, and I walked him to the door, thanking him quietly. He squeezed my shoulder and told me to be careful, that people who go to these lengths to control someone don't give up easily. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my laptop, knowing I finally had a way to fight back without Lisa knowing. That night, I waited until Lisa was asleep before accessing the secure partition for the first time. The startup sequence felt like performing a magic trick, holding down the 3 keys and watching the screen flicker into a completely different system. I opened the encrypted browser and started searching for reproductive rights attorneys, typing keywords like fertility fraud and reproductive coercion and unauthorized use of genetic material. Most results were about women's reproductive rights, egg donation disputes, or surrogacy contract violations. My situation was so unusual that standard legal categories didn't quite fit. I refined my search to include medical fraud and psychiatric abuse and consent violations. That's when I found Solomon Fitzpatrick's name. His law firm specialized in medical malpractice and bioethics cases. One article described how he'd represented a woman whose fertility doctor had used his own sperm instead of her husband's chosen donor. Another case involved a man who discovered his genetic material had been used without consent after his death. The parallels to my situation were obvious. I read through every article and case summary I could find about him. He'd won significant settlements and criminal charges against medical professionals who violated reproductive autonomy. His website listed his areas of expertise, and reproductive fraud was prominently featured. I drafted an email explaining my situation, trying to be clear and factual without sounding crazy. I described the fake vasectomy, the harvested sperm, the surrogate pregnancies, the psychiatric hold that declared me incompetent, the planted evidence, and the drugging. I attached photos of some of the contracts and medical documents I'd photographed, being careful not to include anything that would identify me until he responded. I used an encrypted email service Carlos had set up that couldn't be traced back to my regular accounts. I hit send at 2 in the morning and closed the laptop, my hands shaking with nervous energy. This was the first real step toward getting help from someone with actual power to do something about Lisa's operation. The response came 6 hours later, while I was pretending to read the newspaper at breakfast. My phone buzzed with a notification from the secure email app Carlos had installed. I excused myself to the bathroom and opened the message. Solomon had written 3 paragraphs acknowledging receipt of my email and asking for a phone consultation at my earliest convenience. He said my case presented highly unusual circumstances that warranted immediate attention, and he wanted to review the evidence in detail. His tone was professional but urgent, like he recognized something significant in what I'd described. He provided a secure phone number and suggested calling from a location where I could speak freely without being overheard or recorded. I deleted the notification and flushed the toilet for cover before returning to the kitchen. Lisa was scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up as I sat back down. I finished my coffee and announced I had some errands to run, needing to pick up supplies for a project I was working on. She nodded absently, and I grabbed my keys, driving to a shopping center parking lot 3 miles away. I sat in my car and dialed Solomon's number using the secure phone app. He answered on the second ring, and I spent the next 20 minutes walking him through everything in chronological order. He asked pointed questions about dates, medical procedures, contract terms, and the psychiatric evaluation. When I described the planted browser history and email evidence, he was quiet for a moment before explaining that while it complicated things, forensic analysis could prove the files were manufactured. The medical fraud and reproductive coercion were serious enough that prosecutors would likely see through Lisa's defensive strategy. He asked about my current safety and whether I felt in immediate danger. I admitted I was drugged daily and monitored constantly, but that I'd started reducing my medication and had secure communication channels now. He said that was smart and asked if I'd be willing to meet in person to review all the evidence I'd gathered. We scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday at his office downtown. Solomon said he'd review my case pro bono because it had the potential to be a landmark reproductive rights case. He explained that what Lisa had done violated multiple laws around medical consent, bodily autonomy, and reproductive fraud. The psychiatric hold and incompetency declaration added layers of abuse of process and possibly false imprisonment. The drugging constituted assault. The planted evidence was obstruction of justice and possibly conspiracy. He spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from deep expertise, and for the first time in years I felt like someone actually understood the full scope of what had been done to me. He warned that building a case would take time, and we'd need overwhelming evidence before approaching prosecutors. Lisa had clearly planned this operation carefully and would have her own defenses ready. But he said the medical fraud and pattern of victims through the surrogate mothers would help establish that this wasn't just a domestic dispute, but a criminal enterprise. He advised me to continue gathering evidence while maintaining my appearance of compliance. The key was building an unstoppable case before Lisa realized I was no longer under her control. We ended the call, and I sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, letting the reality sink in that I finally had a real attorney willing to fight for me. The fog of helplessness that had surrounded me for 3 years was starting to lift, replaced by something that felt like actual hope. 2 days later, my phone rang with a call from Freya's office asking me to come in for an emergency session that afternoon. The receptionist said Freya had reviewed some medical records and wanted to discuss them with me as soon as possible. I felt a spike of anxiety wondering what she'd found, but I agreed to come in at 3. When I arrived, Freya was waiting in her office with a folder of papers spread across her desk. She gestured for me to sit, and her expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. She explained that she'd been reviewing my medication history and recent blood work as part of standard care documentation. Something hadn't added up about my prescription. The medication I was supposedly taking for blood pressure didn't match the typical dosing or the side effects I'd been reporting. She'd cross-referenced the prescription with pharmaceutical databases, and the medication code didn't correspond to any standard blood pressure treatment. She asked me directly if I knew what I was actually taking. I hesitated, weighing how much to tell her, before deciding she was already suspicious enough that partial honesty was safer than lying. I told her I'd suspected for a while that my wife might be giving me something other than what she claimed. Freya nodded slowly and said she wanted to run independent testing on my blood to determine exactly what substances were in my system. She explained it gently, but her professional concern was obvious. This wasn't just about medication mix-ups, but about the possibility I was being given something without my informed consent. I authorized the blood draw immediately, and Freya took 3 vials, labeling them carefully before sending them to an independent lab she trusted. She said results would take about a week and asked if I felt safe at home. I assured her I was being careful and had started taking steps to protect myself. She made notes in my file and scheduled a follow-up appointment for when the results came back. As I left her office, I felt validated in a way I hadn't expected. Freya's professional concern meant I wasn't crazy or paranoid. A medical expert had looked at the evidence and seen the same red flags I'd been living with. Having her as an ally in the medical field would strengthen my case significantly when the time came to present everything to prosecutors. I drove home feeling like another piece of the foundation was falling into place. The results came back 6 days later, and Freya called me personally to discuss them. Her voice was tight with controlled anger as she explained what the lab had found. My blood showed a mix of anti-anxiety medications and mild sedatives, the kind used to treat severe panic disorders or as pre-surgical relaxation aids. The combination and dosing would absolutely cause memory problems, confusion, and docility. Long-term use at these levels could cause permanent cognitive effects. She said she was horrified and wanted to report this immediately to medical authorities and possibly law enforcement. I asked her to wait, explaining I was building a larger case with an attorney and needed all the evidence compiled before making any official reports. If Lisa found out too soon that people knew about the drugging, she might destroy evidence or disappear. Freya reluctantly agreed, but made me promise to move forward with legal action soon. She documented everything in sealed medical records that could be subpoenaed later. The next evening at dinner, Lisa studied me across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. She asked how my therapy sessions were going and whether the medication was helping with my stress levels. I played up confusion and fatigue, letting my sentences trail off mid-thought and rubbing my temples like I had a headache. I mentioned that Freya thought maybe the dosage needed adjusting because I was feeling more foggy than usual. Lisa nodded thoughtfully and said she'd talk to the pharmacy about increasing my prescription. She watched me take my evening pills with more attention than usual, making sure I swallowed them completely. I'd gotten good at palming half the dose and hiding it, but that night I made a show of being extra compliant. She seemed satisfied and slightly increased the number of pills she gave me over the next few days, not realizing I was only taking a small fraction. The clearer my mind became, the more I had to pretend to be declining. I started leaving tasks half-finished around the house and forgetting conversations we'd had the day before. Lisa's monitoring increased, but her suspicions seemed to ease. She thought the drugs were working better, making me more manageable. The irony of her satisfaction while I was actually breaking free gave me a grim sense of victory. Rajesh called me on the secure phone 3 weeks after I'd hired him with an update on Aaron Richter. He dug deep into Aaron's background and found a pattern that made my stomach turn. Aaron had lost his medical license in another state 7 years ago for falsifying patient records and performing unauthorized procedures. He'd been sanctioned by the medical board for ethical violations involving experimental fertility treatments that weren't approved. After losing his license, he'd moved here and opened a new practice under slightly different credentials, apparently exploiting gaps in cross-state licensing verification. Rajesh had found 2 other patients who'd filed complaints about Aaron performing procedures that didn't match what they'd consented to, though neither case had resulted in criminal charges. The pattern established that Aaron was exactly the kind of doctor who would participate in Lisa's scheme. He had a history of disregarding patient consent and manipulating medical procedures for his own purposes. This background would be critical for establishing credibility that he would absolutely perform a fake vasectomy and sperm extraction without my knowledge. Rajesh sent me encrypted files with all the documentation, medical board complaints, licensing records, and patient testimonies. I added everything to my growing evidence folder, feeling the case getting stronger with each new piece. I arranged another secret meeting with Haley at the same library, this time asking if she knew other surrogate mothers who might be having doubts about the program. She arrived looking nervous but determined, and she'd brought 2 other women with her. Both were pregnant, one about 5 months along and the other just starting to show. Haley introduced them using only first names and explained that they'd all been talking privately about concerns with their contracts. The first woman described how Lisa had recruited her through a Facebook group for people struggling financially, promising easy money for carrying a baby. The contract had seemed straightforward at first, but once she was pregnant, Lisa had started imposing strict rules about diet, activity, and medical appointments. Any deviation resulted in threats about contract violations and financial penalties. The second woman had a similar story, but added that Lisa had threatened to report her to immigration authorities if she didn't comply, even though she was a legal resident. The coercion was obvious and systematic across multiple victims. I asked if they'd be willing to have their testimonies recorded, and they both agreed, understanding that their cooperation might help stop Lisa from exploiting others. I used my phone to record each woman describing her recruitment, the contract terms, and the coercive tactics Lisa used to maintain control. All 3 women talked about feeling trapped, unable to back out without facing financial ruin or worse. The pattern of victimization extended far beyond just me. Lisa had built an operation that preyed on vulnerable people and used their desperation against them. I promised to protect their identities as much as possible while using their testimonies to build the case. After they left, I uploaded the recordings to my secure cloud storage, knowing this evidence would be crucial for showing prosecutors that Lisa's operation wasn't just about reproductive fraud, but about systematic exploitation of multiple victims. Solomon called me the following Monday to say he'd filed a sealed motion with a judge he trusted. The motion requested a protective order and preliminary investigation into Lisa's activities without notifying her. Sealed filings meant Lisa wouldn't be alerted that legal action was beginning until we were ready to move forward with the full case. The judge had reviewed the evidence summaries Solomon provided and agreed there was sufficient cause for concern to warrant a confidential investigation. Solomon explained that this was a critical step because it meant the legal system was now formally involved, even if quietly. Prosecutors would begin reviewing the evidence and determining what charges to file. The sealed nature protected me from retaliation while the investigation proceeded. He said we were probably looking at another 4 to 6 weeks before everything would come together for arrests and formal charges. During that time, I needed to continue gathering evidence and maintaining my appearance of being under Lisa's control. The legal machinery was finally turning in my favor, slowly, but inevitably. I felt the weight of 3 years of helplessness starting to shift, replaced by the knowledge that people with actual authority were now working to hold Lisa accountable for what she'd done. I drove to my mother's house 3 days later, needing to see my son again and have the conversation I'd been avoiding. She opened the door with a smile that faded when she saw my face. The boy was playing with blocks in the living room, his dark hair falling across his forehead exactly like mine did at that age. I watched him stack the blocks carefully, his little tongue poking out in concentration, and felt my chest tighten. My mother sat beside me on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. I told her everything, keeping my voice low so the boy wouldn't hear. The fake vasectomy, the drugging, the planted evidence, the 23 pregnancies. She went pale, her hands starting to shake. She kept looking at the boy, and then back at me, her eyes filling with tears. Lisa had told her I'd donated sperm before our marriage, that this was a gift I'd wanted to give. My mother had believed she was helping fulfill my wishes, not participating in reproductive fraud. She started crying, covering her mouth with her hand. I asked if she would testify about what Lisa had told her, about the $50,000 she'd paid, about the confidentiality agreements. She nodded, still crying, and reached for my hand. The boy looked up from his blocks and asked if Grandma was sad. I went over and sat on the floor with him, helping him build a tower while my mother composed herself. He chattered about preschool and his friends, completely unaware that his entire existence was built on lies and manipulation. When it was time to leave, he hugged me without hesitation, calling me the nice man who visits sometimes. My mother walked me to the door and promised she would do whatever was needed to help. I drove home feeling like my heart had been put through a shredder. Carlos met me at a coffee shop the next afternoon, bringing a laptop and a small black device I didn't recognize. He explained the dead man's switch concept while sketching a diagram on a napkin. If I didn't check in with a secure server every 48 hours, the system would automatically send encrypted files to multiple recipients. Law enforcement, media outlets, backup attorneys, even some advocacy organizations. Everything would go public if Lisa tried to have me recommitted or worse. Carlos spent 2 hours setting it up on my secure partition, walking me through the check-in process until I could do it without thinking. He made me practice on a dummy system, timing how long it took. The insurance policy felt like putting on armor after years of fighting naked. I finally had leverage, something to protect me if Lisa realized I was no longer under her control. Carlos also gave me a second burner phone with a panic button that would trigger the immediate release if I was in danger. I tested it once, watching the confirmation flash on the screen, then carefully disabled the actual send function. Just knowing I had that option made me breathe easier. I got home that evening to find Lisa sitting at the kitchen table with a strange expression on her face. She had a pregnancy test in her hand, the little window showing 2 pink lines. She watched me carefully as she held it up, her smile cold and calculated. I felt my stomach drop but forced excitement onto my face, asking if it was real. She said yes, that she'd stop taking her birth control and use the stored material one more time. Another child to bind me to her operation, another piece of leverage. I hugged her like I was supposed to, feeling her body tense against mine. She was testing me, watching for any sign that I wasn't the docile, medicated husband anymore. I played along perfectly, suggesting names and asking about due dates while my mind raced. This was escalation, a new layer of control. I excused myself to the bathroom and used my hidden phone to document everything, including a photo of the test she'd left on the counter. The manipulation was so obvious now that I could see through her tactics, but I had to pretend nothing had changed. That night, I lay awake beside her, wondering if she was really pregnant or if this was another manipulation. Either way, it was coercion, another attempt to trap me. Rajesh called 2 days later with news about the psychiatric evaluator who'd declared me incompetent. He'd pulled the professional records and found a pattern of disciplinary actions going back 15 years. Ethics violations, complaints from patients, sanctions from the state medical board. The man had been suspended twice and was currently on probation. His credibility was already damaged in professional circles, which meant his evaluation of me would be easier to challenge. Rajesh sent me the full report, page after page of documented misconduct. Every piece of evidence we gathered made Lisa's trap look more obviously fake. The psychiatric hold, the incompetency declaration, the planted browser history, all of it was falling apart under real investigation. I felt vindication building with each new discovery, the truth becoming impossible to deny. Rajesh also found that the evaluator had financial connections to Aaron, Lisa's cousin. They'd worked together on multiple cases, always with outcomes that benefited Aaron's patients in custody disputes or competency hearings. The corruption went deeper than just my case. My next session with Freya was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and I decided it was time to tell her everything. I brought my tablet with some of the evidence loaded on the secure partition, photos of contracts and medical records. Freya listened without interrupting as I explained the fake vasectomy, the sperm extraction, the years of drugging. I showed her the blood test results proving what I'd actually been taking. Her face went through shock, horror, and anger as she processed what I was telling her. She believed me completely, having already suspected the medication manipulation. She said she'd provide expert testimony about the drugging and its effects on my mental state, that this was one of the most extreme cases of medical abuse she'd encountered. Freya also explained how the medication cocktail would have made me suggestible and compliant, perfect for Lisa's control. She asked about my current mental state, and I told her about reducing the dosage, about the clarity returning. Freya made notes in her file, documenting everything for the legal case. She also gave me information about trauma therapy, saying I'd need serious support once this was over. Having her validation and professional backing felt like gaining a powerful ally. Solomon called me the following Monday with the news I'd been waiting for. A prosecutor who specialized in complex fraud cases had agreed to take on a formal investigation. Solomon had presented the evidence summaries, and the prosecutor was fascinated by the reproductive coercion angle. This could set legal precedent, establish new protections for victims of fertility fraud. We were moving from defensive planning to active legal offense. The prosecutor wanted to meet with me directly within the next 2 weeks to review everything in detail. Solomon explained that this was the turning point, where the legal system officially recognized the crimes against me. The prosecutor would have subpoena power, investigative resources, the ability to bring criminal charges. Everything we'd been building toward was finally happening. Solomon warned me that once subpoenas were issued, Lisa would likely figure out something was wrong. I needed to be ready for her to escalate or try to run. We discussed safety protocols, and I told him about the dead man switch Carlos had set up. Solomon approved, saying it was smart insurance. The prosecutor's office moved faster than I expected. Within a week, Solomon called to say subpoenas had been issued for Lisa's business records, Aaron's medical files, and financial records from the families who'd purchased genetic material. Everything was sealed to prevent Lisa from being notified, but the investigation was now official. Court orders had been sent to banks, medical facilities, and the fertility clinic where Lisa had sold her eggs. The net was closing around her operation. I felt terror and readiness in equal measure, knowing we were approaching the point where Lisa would find out. Solomon advised me to maintain normal behavior at home, to keep taking the fake medication publicly, to act like nothing had changed. The investigation would take a few more weeks to gather all the evidence before moving to arrests. I had to hold on just a little longer without tipping Lisa off. Every morning I woke up next to her felt like sleeping beside a bomb. I arranged to meet with all 3 surrogate mothers who were cooperating, wanting to make sure our testimonies were consistent. We gathered at a private room Rajesh had rented at a hotel, somewhere Lisa wouldn't think to monitor. Haley was 7 months pregnant now, her belly round and prominent. The other 2 women were at different stages, both looking nervous but determined. We spent 3 hours going through our stories, making sure the timeline matched, that we could all verify Lisa's coercive tactics and the suspicious contract terms. They talked about feeling trapped, about threats Lisa had made regarding legal consequences if they backed out. I promised that their babies would be protected regardless of what happened with the case, that I wasn't trying to take custody from anyone. These women were victims just like me, exploited by Lisa's manipulation. Haley asked what would happen after the arrests, and I admitted I didn't know for certain. Solomon was working on protective orders for all the surrogates, making sure they couldn't be punished for the contracts they'd signed under duress. We exchanged encrypted contact information and agreed to check in regularly as things progressed. Carlos called me in a panic 2 days later, his voice tight with urgency. He'd been monitoring my mother's phone as part of our security protocols and discovered spyware similar to what had been on my devices. Lisa had been monitoring my mother's calls and texts, which meant she might know about our conversations. We immediately switched all communication to the encrypted apps Carlos had set up. I warned my mother to be careful what she said on her regular phone, to assume Lisa was listening. The chess game was accelerating toward confrontation, and Lisa was preparing her own defensive moves. Carlos checked Rajesh's devices and found attempted intrusions, sophisticated attacks that had been blocked by his security. Lisa was actively trying to discover what we were planning. The timeline was compressing whether we wanted it to or not. I felt the pressure building, knowing the confrontation was coming soon. Solomon called an emergency meeting at his office to discuss the compressed timeline. He explained that Lisa's pregnancy claim created legal urgency. If she was actually pregnant with my genetic material again, we needed to stop the exploitation before another child was created. The prosecutor agreed that we couldn't wait the full investigative timeline. They were scheduling the formal confrontation and arrest for the following week, giving us just 7 days to make final preparations. Solomon walked me through what would happen, how the arrests would be coordinated, where I needed to be for safety. The prosecutor wanted me at the station when Lisa was brought in, ready to give my statement while everything was fresh. Rajesh would provide all his investigative files. Freya would be available for expert testimony. The surrogate mothers would give their statements separately. Everything was coming together faster than I'd expected, the momentum building toward an unavoidable collision. I left Solomon's office feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. I spent the next 7 days checking every piece of evidence 3 times over, making sure nothing could fall apart under scrutiny. Rajesh came by the house while Lisa was at work, bringing his equipment to do one final sweep of every room. He found the first camera hidden inside a smoke detector in the bedroom, lens pointed directly at the bed where I slept. The second was built into a picture frame on my desk, watching everything I did on my computer. The third was the worst, tucked inside the bathroom mirror where I'd been taking my reduced medication doses and hiding the pills. She'd been watching me the entire time, seeing me palm the tablets and stash them away. My hands shook as Rajesh carefully photographed each camera in place before disabling them. She knew I was resisting. She'd been letting me think I was clever while documenting my rebellion. Rajesh assured me the secure partition on my computer had protected my real work, that the cameras couldn't see through his encryption. But the violation burned deeper than anything else she'd done. Even my most private moments had been performance for her surveillance. We left the cameras disabled but in place, making it look like technical failures rather than discovery. Let her wonder what went wrong with her spy system. Solomon called that afternoon with final confirmation that everything was ready for the next morning. The prosecutor had coordinated with 3 different police departments to execute simultaneous warrants. Timing had to be perfect, so Lisa couldn't warn Aaron or destroy evidence once she realized what was happening. I was supposed to be at Solomon's office by 6 in the morning, before Lisa woke up. I'd leave a note saying I had an early meeting, nothing suspicious. Just another normal day until it wasn't. That night I couldn't sleep at all, lying in bed next to Lisa while my mind ran through every possible way this could go wrong. What if the prosecutor decided the case was too weird to pursue? What if Lisa had backup plans I didn't know about? What if she'd hidden evidence somewhere we hadn't found? I kept thinking about all those children, 31 pregnancies she'd orchestrated using my genetic material without consent. Some of them were already born and living with families who had no idea their donor wasn't anonymous. Others were still growing inside women who thought they'd signed up for something legitimate. Around 3 in the morning, I got up quietly and went to my computer, using the secure partition to write letters I hoped no one would ever need to read. I wrote to my son at my mother's house, explaining everything in simple words a child could understand someday when he was old enough. I told him none of this was his fault, that I loved him even though we'd never met properly, that I was fighting to be his father for real. I wrote to the other children I'd never know, scattered across the country in homes where they'd grow up thinking they came from anonymous donor number whatever. I told them about their genetic history, my family's medical background, things they deserved to know. I wrote to Haley's baby, due in just a few weeks now, explaining that her mother was brave and strong and had been victimized just like me. I saved all 3 letters in the secure cloud storage where they'd be safe even if something happened to me. Then I sat in the dark living room watching the clock tick toward morning, feeling like I was standing on the platform before a high dive, knowing the only way out was to jump. I left the house at 5:30 with my note on the kitchen counter, driving through empty streets to Solomon's office downtown. He was already there with coffee and a box of files, looking tired but focused. We went over the timeline one more time while we waited for confirmation that the warrants were being served. At exactly 7 o'clock, Solomon's phone buzzed with a text from the prosecutor. It was happening. Police were at Lisa's apartment complex right now, at Aaron's clinic, and at our house where Lisa would be waking up to find officers with a search warrant. I sat in Solomon's conference room watching the morning light spread across the city, knowing that somewhere out there the careful trap I'd built was finally springing shut. The relief was so strong it made me dizzy, but it mixed with this sick feeling in my stomach because I knew how much damage had already been done that could never be fixed. All those children existed because Lisa had stolen my genetic material and sold it. All those families had been lied to about where their babies came from. All those years I'd been drugged and controlled, losing pieces of myself I'd never get back. Legal justice was happening, but it couldn't undo any of that. Solomon's phone kept buzzing with updates from the prosecutor. Lisa had been found at the apartment complex like we'd predicted, arriving for a meeting with the surrogate mothers. She'd tried to run when she saw the police cars, but they'd blocked the exits. Aaron was at his clinic preparing for his first appointment of the day when officers walked in with handcuffs. Both of them were being transported to the station for booking and questioning. The police found everything at the apartment complex, boxes and boxes of records Lisa had been stupid enough to keep in physical form. Financial ledgers showing every payment, every contract, every transaction in her operation. The prosecutor sent Solomon a preliminary count, and my stomach dropped when I saw the number. 31 active pregnancies, not the 23 we documented. 8 more women we hadn't even known about, all carrying babies with my genetic material. Lisa's business was even bigger than our investigation had uncovered. She'd been running this operation for 8 years, since right after our son died, building it larger and more complex every year. The revenue totals made me sick. Over $2 million she'd made selling my children to families who thought they were getting anonymous donor sperm. $2 million from violating my body and autonomy, from stealing my genetic material and using it without consent. The prosecutor texted that they were charging her with medical fraud, reproductive coercion, drugging, falsifying records, operating an unlicensed fertility business, and about a dozen other crimes I couldn't even process. Aaron was getting arrested at his clinic, officers walking him out in handcuffs past waiting patients who had no idea their doctor had been performing fake surgeries and real sperm extractions for years. Constance was being brought in for questioning too, the prosecutor suspecting she'd helped falsify medical records and manage the business side of Lisa's operation. I felt this rush of vindication watching the people who'd violated me face actual consequences. They weren't going to walk away from this. They weren't going to keep destroying lives. The system was finally working the way it was supposed to, protecting victims instead of enabling abusers. Solomon drove me to the police station where I spent 4 hours giving my formal statement to prosecutors, walking them through the entire timeline from that day 8 years ago when I thought I was getting a vasectomy. I explained how Aaron had performed sperm extraction instead, how Lisa had me declared mentally incompetent during a forced psychiatric hold, how she'd been drugging me for years to keep me compliant. I showed them Freya's medical analysis of my blood work proving I'd been given sedatives instead of blood pressure medication. I showed them the financial records Rajesh had copied, the contracts with surrogate mothers, the fake medical documents. The prosecutors recorded everything, taking notes and asking questions that showed they understood how serious this was. They brought in a forensic tech who analyzed my laptop right there in the interview room, proving that the planted browser history had been created while I was provably elsewhere. The timestamps on the files didn't match my actual location data from my phone, my credit card transactions, security footage from my workplace. Lisa's defensive trap fell apart under basic technical scrutiny. She'd been so confident in her control over me that she'd gotten sloppy with the details. The tech explained to the prosecutors that the files were created using remote access software, someone else controlling my computer while I wasn't home. They could trace it back to Lisa's devices, prove she'd planted everything. My credibility was solid. Freya arrived around noon to give her expert testimony about the medication manipulation and its effects on memory and cognition. She'd brought detailed medical records showing the progression of my symptoms, how they'd worsened over the years as Lisa increased my dosage. She explained to the prosecutors that what Lisa had done constituted medical abuse and chemical restraint, keeping me docile and confused so I couldn't resist or escape. Rajesh provided all his investigative files, the surveillance photos, the financial tracking, the interviews with surrogate mothers. Everything we'd built over the past months came together into an overwhelming case that the prosecutors said was the strongest reproductive coercion case they'd ever seen. The story broke on local news that afternoon, while I was still at the police station, and my phone started exploding with calls and messages I couldn't bring myself to answer. The media had gotten hold of the basic facts and were running with headlines about illegal surrogacy and reproductive fraud. I felt horrified seeing my private violation become public entertainment, but Solomon reminded me that publicity would help. Other victims would come forward. Other families would learn the truth about where their children came from. The exposure would prevent Lisa from ever doing this again to anyone else. By evening, 3 more families had contacted the prosecutor's office, shocked and angry after seeing the news and recognizing details that matched their own surrogacy arrangements. They'd paid Lisa's operation for sperm they thought came from an anonymous donor, never knowing it was actually from me, obtained without my consent. The victim count kept climbing. Each new family that came forward represented another child with my genetic material, another piece of my biology scattered across the country without my knowledge or permission. The prosecutors told me they were opening a victim assistance program to help all the families navigate the legal and emotional aftermath. They were setting up DNA testing to confirm parentage, counseling services for the children who'd eventually learn the truth, legal support for families who wanted to pursue civil cases against Lisa. The scope of the damage was so big it would take years to fully address. The judge granted me an emergency restraining order that same day, signing papers that legally prohibited Lisa from contacting me in any way pending trial. The order covered phone calls, emails, texts, social media, physical proximity, everything. She couldn't get near me or communicate with me at all. The judge also suspended the incompetency declaration immediately, stating that the evidence of fraud and coercion made the original psychiatric evaluation invalid. After 3 years of being legally declared unfit to make my own decisions, I was suddenly recognized as a competent adult again. The relief was so intense, I almost broke down crying right there in the courtroom. I could make my own medical decisions. I could manage my own finances. I could sign legal documents without needing Lisa's approval. The cage she'd built around me was finally unlocked. Solomon walked me through what came next, the preliminary hearings and grand jury and eventual trial that would take months to unfold. He warned me that Lisa's defense attorneys would try every tactic to discredit me, to make me look unstable or vindictive. But the evidence was too strong. The medical fraud was documented. The drugging was proven. The financial records showed clear criminal enterprise. We had her, truly had her, in ways that would stand up to any defense strategy. I went home that night to an empty house, Lisa's belongings still scattered everywhere like she'd just stepped out and would return any minute. But she wouldn't. She was in jail awaiting arraignment, and I was free for the first time in 8 years. My mother called the next morning asking if she could bring my son to meet me officially, not just the awkward visit where I discovered the truth, but a real introduction as his father. I said yes immediately, then spent 2 hours cleaning the house and panicking about what to say to a 3-year-old who didn't know me at all. They arrived around noon, my mother looking nervous and my son hiding behind her legs until she coaxed him forward. He had my eyes, my exact eye color and shape, and seeing my own features reflected in his small face made my chest tight. I knelt down to his level and introduced myself, and he studied me seriously before asking if I had any trucks to play with. We spent the afternoon on the living room floor with his toy collection, building roads and crashing vehicles while my mother watched with tears running down her face. He was warm and affectionate once he relaxed, climbing into my lap and chattering about his preschool friends and his favorite cartoon. The connection felt natural despite the bizarre circumstances of his creation and placement. He was my son, genetically, and now hopefully legally. My mother explained that she wanted me to have full custody, that she'd only taken him because Lisa convinced her it was what I wanted. She'd been lied to, just like everyone else. We agreed to start the legal process immediately, working with Solomon to establish my parental rights and transition custody gradually so my son wouldn't be traumatized by sudden changes. The courts would be sympathetic, given how he was conceived and placed, the clear fraud and coercion involved. He deserved stability and a real relationship with his biological father, not the manufactured arrangement Lisa had created. Haley went into labor 2 weeks after Lisa's arrest, calling me from the hospital in a panic because her contracting family had backed out after learning the truth about the genetic material. She was alone and scared and about to give birth to a baby whose legal status was completely unclear. I drove to the hospital immediately, arriving just as she was moved to a delivery room. I stayed in the waiting area while she labored, checking my phone obsessively for updates. 7 hours later, a nurse came out to tell me Haley had delivered a healthy baby girl and was asking for me. I went into the recovery room and saw Haley holding this tiny infant with a full head of dark hair, and the complexity of the situation hit me all over again. This baby had my genetic material, but Haley was her mother in every way that mattered. She'd carried her for 9 months, gone through labor, would raise her and love her. The invalid contract didn't change any of that. Haley looked exhausted but peaceful, and she asked me what I wanted to do about custody. I told her the truth, that I wasn't trying to take her child away. Haley was the mother who'd carried and birthed her. The baby deserved to stay with her mother, not get caught up in more legal chaos. We agreed to work with attorneys to establish clear parental rights, Haley as the legal mother with full custody, and me listed as the genetic father with no custody claims. I'd help financially when she needed it, and maintain a relationship as an uncle figure, someone in the baby's life but not trying to be her father. The baby deserved stability and love, not another court battle over her existence. Haley cried and thanked me, and I held my genetic daughter for a few minutes before giving her back to her real mother. She was beautiful and perfect, and she represented both the worst violation I'd experienced and the possibility of something good coming from terrible circumstances. Over the next few months, I spent hours each week at the prosecutor's office, going through every document and contract Lisa had created. The lead prosecutor was a woman in her 50s who specialized in medical fraud cases, and she treated me with a kind of careful respect that I appreciated. She never acted like I was weak or broken, just someone who'd been victimized by a complicated crime. We built the case piece by piece, organizing evidence into categories: medical fraud, reproductive coercion, drugging, falsified psychiatric records, operating an unlicensed fertility business. Each charge had its own stack of documentation, witness statements, financial records. The legal complexity was overwhelming at first, but breaking it down into specific crimes made it feel manageable. Aaron's medical files showed the fake vasectomy procedure in detail, with my signed consent forms that looked legitimate, but contained hidden language about sperm extraction. Lisa's business records documented every surrogate arrangement, every payment, every genetic material transaction. The bank statements showed over $2 million flowing through accounts I never knew existed. The evidence was so thorough that the prosecutors kept saying they'd never seen a case this well documented. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that Lisa's own meticulous record-keeping would be what destroyed her. I started therapy with a trauma specialist named Dr. Lindqvist 3 times a week, working through everything that had happened. The first few sessions were just me sitting there trying to find words for the violation I felt. Dr. Lindqvist was patient, never pushing, just letting me process at my own pace. We talked about bodily autonomy and how the fake vasectomy was a form of assault that went on for years. We discussed the drugging and how it had stolen my ability to think clearly, to make decisions, to protect myself. The medication had kept me docile and confused, while Lisa built her entire operation around my genetic material. Dr. Lindqvist explained that trauma like this takes years to fully process, that there's no quick fix or simple resolution. But working with a clear mind, without the fog of those pills, felt like progress in itself. I could remember things now, connect events, see patterns I'd missed before. The genetic children I'd never know were the hardest part to discuss. 18 people out there with my DNA, growing up in families who thought they'd gotten anonymous donor sperm. I'd never be their father, never know most of them, never have any real relationship with them. That loss felt impossible to quantify or grieve properly. Dr. Lindqvist helped me understand that I could acknowledge that pain without letting it consume me, that I could build a life even with that wound. The surrogate mothers who'd been trapped in Lisa's coercive contracts formed a support group, and Haley invited me to attend some of the meetings. There were 7 women total, all at different stages of pregnancy or postpartum, all trying to figure out how to move forward. Some of them had signed contracts thinking they were helping infertile couples, only to discover the genetic material came from a scheme they never agreed to. Others had been lied to about the compensation or the legal protections they'd have. The meetings were held in a community center basement, and I sat in a circle with these women who were all connected to me through Lisa's exploitation. I shared my perspective about the fake vasectomy and the drugging, and they shared their experiences with Lisa's manipulation and control. Some of them decided to keep the babies they were carrying, forming bonds during pregnancy that felt more important than the circumstances of conception. Others chose adoption, wanting the children to go to families who could provide stability without the trauma attached. A few were still undecided, working through their options with counselors and lawyers. I supported whatever decision each person made for themselves, knowing that every situation was different and complicated. We were all just trying to navigate the aftermath of Lisa's exploitation, finding ways to reclaim some control over our lives and bodies. 8 months after Lisa's arrest, her trial began at the county courthouse. I arrived early that first morning, dressed in a suit that felt too formal, my hands shaking as I walked through security. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything feel sterile and official. Lisa sat at the defense table in a gray suit, her hair pulled back, looking calm and composed like she was attending a business meeting. Seeing her there, knowing she couldn't control me anymore, was both terrifying and empowering. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through everything from the fake vasectomy, to the drugging, to the systematic violation of my reproductive rights. The prosecutor asked detailed questions about the medical procedure, making me describe how I'd believed I was getting sterilized while they were actually extracting sperm. I explained the medication that kept me docile and confused, the memory gaps, the years of not understanding what was happening to my own body. I described finding the contracts and realizing Lisa had been selling my genetic material to create children I'd never know. The jury listened with expressions that shifted from confusion to horror as they understood the full scope of what she'd done. Some of them looked at Lisa with open disgust, while others just stared at me with something like pity. During cross-examination, Lisa's attorney tried to suggest I'd known about the sperm extraction, that I'd been a willing participant who changed my mind later. But the medical records were clear, and my testimony about the drugging was backed up by Dr. Lindqvist's evaluation and the blood tests Freya had ordered. By the end of my testimony, I felt drained but vindicated, knowing I'd told the truth clearly and completely. Aaron Richter took a plea deal 3 weeks into the trial, agreeing to testify against Lisa in exchange for a reduced sentence. He walked into the courtroom looking older than I remembered, his face gray and tired. He sat in the witness box and described how Lisa had recruited him 9 years ago, before our second child was even born, to perform the fake vasectomy and sperm extraction. He admitted they'd planned it from the beginning, that Lisa had approached him with the scheme, and he'd agreed because she was family, and promised him a cut of the profits. He explained the surgical procedure in detail, how they'd made it look like a standard vasectomy while actually extracting viable sperm for cryogenic storage. He described falsifying my consent forms to include language about reproductive rights that I never understood I was signing. His testimony was clinical and detailed, showing premeditation and conspiracy that destroyed any remaining credibility Lisa's defense had. Her attorney tried to discredit him as a criminal saving himself, but the documentation supported everything he said. Lisa sat at the defense table looking furious, her composure finally cracking as her co-conspirator turned on her completely. The prosecution played recorded phone calls between Lisa and Aaron, discussing payments and new surrogate arrangements, conversations that proved ongoing conspiracy. By the time Aaron stepped down from the witness stand, Lisa's defense had crumbled entirely. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with a verdict. I sat in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by some of the surrogate mothers and Solomon, waiting while my heart hammered against my ribs. When the jury foreman stood and read "guilty" on all counts, the relief hit me so hard I nearly passed out. Lisa showed no emotion as the verdicts were read one by one. Medical fraud, reproductive coercion, drugging, falsifying psychiatric records, operating an unlicensed fertility business. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and I attended that hearing too, needing to see it through completely. Lisa was sentenced to 18 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the combined charges. It wasn't enough time for what she'd done, for the years she'd stolen from me and the children she'd created without consent, but it was significant, more than I'd hoped for when I first contacted Rajesh. I felt a complicated mix of relief, anger, and sadness watching the bailiff lead her away in handcuffs. Relief that she was finally facing consequences, anger that it took so long and hurt so many people, sadness for the marriage I'd thought we had that was apparently never real. She looked at me once before they took her out, and I stared back without flinching. She had no power over me anymore. Constance Richter received a lighter sentence of 5 years for her role in falsifying medical records and helping cover up the scheme. She'd been the clinic administrator who processed the paperwork and made sure everything looked legitimate on the surface. Her attorney argued she'd been manipulated by her husband and Lisa, that she hadn't fully understood the scope of what was happening. The judge was somewhat sympathetic but still imposed prison time for her active participation. The psychiatric evaluator who declared me incompetent lost his license permanently after an investigation by the state medical board. They found he'd falsified other evaluations too, part of a pattern of unethical behavior that finally caught up with him. Each person who'd participated in Lisa's scheme faced consequences appropriate to their level of involvement. Some got prison time, others lost professional licenses, a few faced civil lawsuits from victims. Watching the legal system actually work, actually hold people accountable, restored some faith I'd lost over the past few years. The civil judgment came through 6 months after Lisa's criminal conviction. I was awarded $2 million from Lisa's assets, essentially everything she'd earned from her illegal operation. The judge ruled that all proceeds from the fertility fraud belonged to the victims, and I was the primary victim whose genetic material had been exploited. The money went into accounts I set up for specific purposes: ongoing therapy for myself and the surrogate mothers who needed it, a trust fund for my son that he'd access when he turned 18, and a foundation to support other victims of reproductive coercion. Financial compensation didn't heal the violation or undo what happened. No amount of money could give me back the years Lisa stole or change the fact that I have genetic children I'll never really know. But it provided practical support for recovery and let me help other people who'd been hurt by her scheme. I could afford the intensive therapy I needed, help the surrogate mothers with their medical bills and legal fees, and make sure my son had resources for his future. The money felt like reclaiming something, taking back what Lisa had stolen and using it for actual good, instead of her twisted operation. My son came to live with me full-time after a gradual transition period that took about 4 months. At first, he spent weekends at my apartment while still living primarily with my mother. Then it became half the week, then full-time with regular visits to my mother's house. The transition was harder on him than I'd expected. He was only 3 years old and didn't understand why everything was changing, why he couldn't see his grandmother every day anymore, why this man who was suddenly his father had such a complicated relationship with the woman who'd arranged his existence. We worked with a child therapist who specialized in complex family situations, helping him process the changes in age-appropriate ways. I learned how to be a father to a toddler, figuring out routines and meals and bedtime stories. Some days were good, full of small joys like watching him play with blocks or hearing him laugh at something silly. Other days were hard when he cried for my mother or asked questions I didn't know how to answer. But slowly, we built a real father-son relationship based on trust and consistency. My mother visited regularly, usually twice a week, and we were all working through our guilt and trauma in therapy. She was dealing with her role in Lisa's scheme, the fact that she'd paid for a grandchild without questioning where the genetic material came from or whether I'd actually consented. We had difficult conversations about boundaries and honesty, about how to move forward without pretending the past didn't happen. We were slowly becoming a family, though not the one any of us expected or would have chosen. I connected with some of the families who'd unknowingly raised my biological children through a mediator who specialized in complex genetic situations. Not all of them wanted contact, and I respected that completely. These were their children, raised from birth, loved and bonded to their families. I wasn't trying to disrupt their lives or claim any parental rights. But a few families were open to limited contact, wanting their children to know their genetic history and medical background. I met 3 of my genetic children in supervised settings over the course of several months. The first was a 5-year-old girl with my dark hair and the same crooked smile I see in photos of myself as a kid. Her parents were kind and careful, letting us meet at a park with the mediator present. She played on the swings while I talked with her parents about family medical history and answered their questions about the situation. The second was a 7-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and had my exact eye color. His family invited me to their home for a short visit, and we spent an hour looking at his dinosaur collection while his parents watched carefully. The third was a toddler, barely 2 years old, who wouldn't remember this meeting, but whose parents wanted documentation of the genetic connection for future reference. Each meeting was surreal and emotional in different ways. These children had my DNA but weren't my children in any real sense. I wasn't their father, wasn't trying to be, couldn't be even if I wanted to. They had parents who loved them and lives that didn't include me. But they deserved to know their genetic history, deserved to have answers if they ever had questions, deserved to know they weren't products of anonymous donation, but of a complicated crime that wasn't their fault. We were figuring out what these relationships could be, building something new that didn't fit traditional categories, but felt right for everyone involved. Haley sent me a photo of her daughter's first birthday party, the little girl smashing her face into a pink frosted cake while wearing a tiny crown. I smiled at my phone and transferred money into Haley's account for daycare expenses, something I'd been doing monthly since the baby was born. We met for coffee every few weeks at a place halfway between our homes, and she'd update me on developmental milestones while I showed her pictures of my son. The relationship worked because we'd both survived something horrible together and came out the other side wanting to help each other heal rather than run away from the reminder. Her daughter called me uncle at Haley's suggestion, and I brought presents for birthdays and holidays, careful never to overstep but always available when needed. Haley was thriving as a single mom, working part-time as a nurse while her daughter attended a good daycare program I helped pay for. She'd started dating someone recently, a kind man who knew her full story and accepted the complicated nature of her daughter's genetic origins. Watching her build a happy life after everything Lisa put her through gave me hope that recovery was actually possible. Carlos came over on a Saturday morning with 3 boxes of new electronics and spent 6 hours setting up what he called my digital fortress. He installed encrypted phones, configured secure email systems, and built custom privacy protections into every device I owned. I watched him work and felt grateful to have a friend with these specific skills, someone who understood that my paranoia about technology wasn't irrational but necessary after years of surveillance. He showed me how to check for spyware, how to verify my devices were clean, and how to maintain proper security protocols going forward. The violation of having every keystroke monitored for years had left scars that would probably never fully heal. But Carlos's patient teaching helped me trust technology again with proper safeguards in place. He refused payment for any of it, saying that helping me reclaim my privacy was payment enough for their friendship. We ordered pizza and talked about normal things like sports and movies, and I realized how much I'd missed having regular friendships with people who weren't connected to the legal nightmare of my life. Solomon called me about testifying before the state legislature on a bill addressing reproductive coercion and fertility fraud. My case had become a catalyst for legal reform, and lawmakers wanted to hear directly from someone who'd experienced this specific type of violation. I said yes, despite the terror that flooded through me at the thought of speaking publicly about the most humiliating details of my life. We met at his office to prepare my testimony, and he coached me on staying focused and calm while discussing traumatic events. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, but still intimidating, filled with legislators and their staff members taking notes while I spoke into a microphone. I told them about the fake vasectomy, the drugging, the years of exploitation, and the legal gaps that had allowed Lisa to operate her scheme for so long. Several legislators asked questions, and I answered as clearly as I could, focusing on how the laws needed to change to protect other people from similar violations. Walking out of that building afterward, I felt shaky but proud that my terrible experience might prevent someone else from going through the same thing. 2 years after Lisa's arrest, I stood in my son's kindergarten classroom for parent night and watched him show me his artwork hanging on the wall. He was thriving in the school, making friends easily and loving his teacher, a patient woman who knew his background and gave him extra support when he needed it. I'd reconnected with old friends over the past year, people I'd lost touch with during the years Lisa controlled my life, and slowly built a support network of people who knew my full story. Some of them had pulled away when they learned the details, unable to handle the complexity and weirdness of my situation, but the ones who stayed became my closest friends. The medication was completely out of my system, and my mind felt sharp and clear in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I could think through complex problems, remember conversations accurately, and make decisions without the fog that had clouded everything for years. My therapist said I was doing remarkably well given what I'd been through, though she cautioned that trauma recovery wasn't linear and I should expect setbacks. Still, standing there watching my son explain his finger painting to me with pure joy, I felt genuinely good about where my life was heading. I started dating again 6 months ago, taking things incredibly slowly and being very upfront about my complicated history on the first date. The woman I'd been seeing worked as a librarian and had her own complex past that made her patient with my need to build trust gradually. We'd been on maybe 15 dates over those months, mostly coffee and walks in the park. Nothing physical beyond holding hands. She knew about Lisa, about the biological children scattered across the state, about my son and the ongoing therapy and the legal advocacy work. She listened without judgment and shared her own stories of surviving a difficult divorce, and we built something careful and genuine between us. Last week, she'd met my son for the first time at a playground, and they'd gotten along well, building sandcastles together while I watched. The possibility of a normal relationship had seemed impossible 2 years ago, but here I was actually experiencing something healthy and real with someone who understood that trust would take time. My son asked about his mother while I was tucking him into bed, wanting to know when she'd come home from the place she was staying. I sat on the edge of his bed and told him gently that his mom had done some bad things that hurt people, and she had to stay in prison for a long time as a consequence. He asked if she'd hurt me, and I said yes, she had, but that he was safe now and loved. His therapist had prepared me for these questions and coached me on giving age-appropriate answers that were honest without being traumatizing. He seemed to accept my explanation and asked if he could visit her someday, and I told him maybe when he was older if he still wanted to. Child therapy was helping him process his unusual family situation better than I'd expected, and his therapist said he was a remarkably resilient kid. He fell asleep holding my hand, and I sat there in the dark feeling grateful that despite everything Lisa had done, I had this one good thing that came from it. Several families with my biological children had agreed to an annual gathering where the kids could meet each other and me, a strange new tradition we were creating together. The first one happened last month at a park pavilion, with 7 children ranging from age 2 to 9 running around while their parents watched nervously. I brought my son and introduced him to his genetic half-siblings, and they all played together like regular kids while the adults made awkward small talk. One of the fathers thanked me for not trying to claim custody or insert myself into their lives beyond these supervised gatherings. And I told him I understood these were their children, raised and loved by them, and I just wanted the kids to know their genetic history. The children seemed to enjoy having siblings they could visit once a year, comparing features and laughing when they noticed they all had the same eye color. We took a group photo at the end, all these kids who shared my DNA standing together, and I felt a complicated mix of sadness and connection. We weren't a traditional family, but we were building something new that worked for everyone involved. 3 years after the confrontation with Lisa, I woke up on a Saturday morning feeling genuinely happy about my life. My son was still asleep in his room, and I made coffee while planning our day at the Science Museum. I had meaningful work advocating for reproductive rights, testifying at hearings, and consulting with lawmakers on new legislation. My relationship was growing stronger, and we were talking about moving in together next year after dating for over a year. I'd connected with several of my biological children through the annual gatherings and occasional supervised visits, building relationships that felt right for everyone. What Lisa did could never be undone, and I carried those scars in ways that would probably affect me forever. But I'd reclaimed my life and autonomy, built a good home for my son, and created a future I was actively choosing, rather than having forced on me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, going through motions while drugged and controlled. I was actually living freely, making my own decisions, building the life I wanted. My son padded into the kitchen in his pajamas asking for pancakes, and I smiled and got out the mixing bowl, ready for whatever this day would bring.